Traditions and Encounters, Chapter 18, by Bentley, McGraw. Eyewitness on the Road with Ibn Battuta. One of the greatest world travelers of all time was the Moroccan legal scholar Ibn Battuta. Born in 1304 at Ziegler, Ibn Battuta followed family tradition and studied Islamic law. In 1325, he left Morocco to make pilgrimage to Mecca. He traveled by caravan across North Africa and through Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, arriving at Mecca in 1326. After completing his Hajj, Ibn Battuta spent a year visiting Mesopotamia and Persia, then traveled by ship through the Red Sea and down the East African coast as far as Kilwa. By 1330, he had returned to Mecca, but then soon set off for India when he learned that the Sultan of Delhi offered handsome rewards to foreign legal scholars. In 1333, he arrived in Delhi after following a long and circuitous land route that took him through Egypt, Syria, Anatolia, Constantinople, the Black Sea, and the great trading cities of Central Asia, Bukhara and Samarkand. For the next 8 years, Ibn Battuta remained in India, serving mostly as a qadi, a judge, in the government of the Sultan of Delhi in 1341. Ibn Battuta began his travels again, this time making his way around southern India, Ceylon, and the Maldive Islands, before continuing to China about 1345. He visited the bustling southern Chinese port cities of Kanzi and Gansu, where he found large communities of Muslim merchants before returning to Morocco in 1349 by way of southern India, the Persian Gulf, Syria, Egypt, and Mecca. Still, Ibn Battuta's travels were not complete. In 1350, he made a short trip to the Kingdom of Granada in southern Spain, and in 1353 he joined a camel caravan across the Sahara Desert to visit the Mali Empire, returning to Morocco in 1355. During his travels, Ibn Battuta visited the equivalent of 44 modern countries and logged more than 117,000 kilometers, which is 73,000 miles. His account of his adventures stands with Marco Polo's book among the classic works of travel literature. Between 1000 and 1500 CE, the peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere traveled, traded, communicated, and interacted more regularly and intensively than ever before. The large empires of the Mongols and other nomadic peoples provided a political foundation for that cross-cultural interaction. When they conquered and pacified vast regions, nomadic peoples provided safe roads for merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and other travelers. Quite apart from the nomadic empires, improvements in maritime technology led to increased traffic in the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. As a result, long-distance travel became much more common than in earlier eras. Merchants and travelers exchanged more than trade goods. They diffused technologies and spread religious faiths. They also exchanged diseases that caused deadly epidemics. During the middle decades of the 14th century, bubonic plague traveled the trade routes and spread through most Eurasia. During its initial furious onslaught, bubonic plague caused death and destruction on a huge scale and interrupted long-distance trade networks. By the early 15th century, however, societies had begun to recover from the plague, Chinese and Western European peoples in particular had re-established their societies and begun to renew cross-cultural contacts in Europe. This effort had profound consequences for modern world history. As they sought entry to the markets of Asia, European mariners sailed to the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific Ocean. Their voyages brought the peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, and Oceania into permanent and sustained interaction with one another. Thus, between 1000 and 1500, cross-cultural interactions pointed toward global interdependence, a principal characteristic of modern world history. Here's the chronology. Long-distance trade and travel. Travelers embarked on long-distance journeys for a variety of reasons. Three of the more important motives for long-distance travel between 100 and 1500 CE were trade, diplomacy, and missionary activity. The cross-cultural interactions that resulted helped spread technological innovations throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. Patterns of long-distance trade. Merchants engaged in long-distance trade relied on two principal networks of trade routes. Luxury goods of high value relative to their weight, such as silk textiles and precious stones, often traveled overland on the Silk Roads. Bulkier commodities, such as steel, stone, and building materials, traveled the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean. Because it would have been unprofitable to transport them overland, the Silk Roads linked all the Eurasian landmass, and trans-Saharan caravan routes drew West Africa into the larger economy of the Eastern Hemisphere. The sea lanes of the Indian Ocean served ports in Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and East Africa, while also offering across via the South China Sea to ports in China, Japan, Korea, and the islands of the Southeast Asia, while offering access to via the South China Sea to ports in China, Japan, Korea, and the islands of the Southeast Asia. Thus, in combination, land and sea routes touched almost every corner of the Eastern Hemisphere. Trading cities. As the volume of the trade increased, the major trading cities and ports grew rapidly, attracting buyers, sellers, brokers, and bankers from parts near and far. When a trading or port city enjoyed a strategic location, maintained good order, and resisted the temptation to levy excessive customs fees, it had the potential to become a major emporium. A case in point is Malacca in modern Malaysia. Founded in the 1390s, within a few decades, Malacca became the principal clearinghouse of trade in the Eastern Indian Ocean. The city's authorities policed the strategic strait of Malacca and maintained a safe market that welcomed all merchants and levied reasonable fees on goods exchanged there. By the end of the 15th century, Malacca had a population of some 50,000 people, according to one report, more than 80 languages could be heard in the city streets. Although the early period of Mongol conquest in the first half of the 13th century caused economic decline, especially in China and Southwest Asia, eventually Mongol rule proved to be a boon for overland trade. Under Mongol rule, merchants traveling the Silk Roads faced less risk of banditry or political turbulence than in previous times. Meanwhile, strong economies in China, India, and Western Europe fueled demand for foreign commodities. Marco Polo, the best-known long-distance traveler of Mongol times, was the Venetian Marco Polo, 1253 to 1324, who with his father and his uncle traveled and traded throughout Mongol lands in the late 13th century. When Marco Polo returned to Europe in 1295, stories of his adventures were compiled by a third party and circulated widely throughout Europe in spite of occasional exaggerations and tall tales. Marco's stories about textiles, spices, gems, and other goods he observed during his travels deeply influenced European readers eager to participate in the lucrative trade networks of Eurasia. Indeed, in the wake of the Polos came hundreds of others whose travels have helped increase European participation in the larger economy of the Eastern Hemisphere. Political and diplomatic travel. Marco Polo came from a family of merchants, and merchants were among the most avid readers of his stories. Excuse me. Yet his experiences also threw light on long-distance travel undertaken for political and diplomatic purposes. Kublai Khan and the other Mongol rulers of China did not entirely trust their Chinese subjects and regularly appointed foreigners to administrative posts. Indeed, while in China, Marco reported that Kublai appointed him the governor of a large trading city of Yangzhou, and that he represented Kublai Khan's interest on diplomatic missions. I'm so sorry about that, guys. Here's sources from the past. I'll kind of pause that a little so you can actually read it. There you go. Mongol Christian diplomacy. The emergence of elaborate trading networks and the establishment of vast imperial states created great demand for political and diplomatic representation. During the centuries after 1000 CE, the 13th century was a time of especially active diplomacy involving distant parties. During the 1240s and 1250s, for example, Pope Innocent IV dispatched a series of envoys who invited the Mongol Khans to convert to Christianity and join Europeans in an alliance against the Muslims in control of Jerusalem. The Khans declined the invitation, proposing in reply that the Pope and European Christians submit to Mongol rule or face destruction. Rabban Suma. Although the early round of Mongol-European diplomacy offered little promise of cooperation, the Mongols later initiated another effort. In 1287, the Mongol Egan of Persia planned to invade the Muslim-held lands of Southwest Asia and capture Jerusalem in hopes of attracting support for the project. He dispatched Rabban Suma, a Nestorian Christian priest of Turkish ancestry, as an envoy to the Pope and European political leaders. Although his efforts did not succeed in garnering European support for Mongol plans, such diplomatic activity illustrates the complexity of political affairs in the Eastern Hemisphere and the need for diplomatic consultation over long distances. The expansion of Islamic influence in the Eastern Hemisphere encouraged a different kind of politically motivated travel. Legal scholars and judges played a crucial role in Islamic society since the Sharia prescribed religious observances and social relationships based on the Quran. Conversions to Islam and the establishment of Islamic states in India, Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa created a demand for Muslims educated in Islamic law. After about the 11th century, educated Muslims from Southwest Asia and North Africa regularly traveled to recently converted lands to help instill Islamic values. Ibn Battuta, best known for the Muslim travelers, was Ibn Battuta, 1304 to 1369. Islamic rulers governed most of the lands Ibn Battuta visited, but very few Muslims educated in the law were available in those lands. With his legal credentials, Ibn Battuta had little difficulty finding government positions as Qadi and advisor to the Sultan of Delhi. He supervised the affairs of a wealthy mosque and heard cases at law which he strictly enforced according to Islamic standards of justice. On one occasion, Ibn Battuta sentenced a man to receive 80 lashes because he had drunk wine 8 years earlier. Ibn Battuta also served as Qadi in both East and West Africa, where he consulted with Muslim rulers and offered advice about government, women's dress, and proper relationships between the sexes. Like many other legal scholars whose stories went unrecorded, Ibn Battuta provided guidance in the ways of Islam and in societies recently converted to faith. Here is the map. So those are the Mongol empires. Missionary campaigns. Sufi missionaries. Islamic values spread not only through the efforts of legal scholars, but also through the missionary activities of Sufi mystics. As in the early days of Islam, Sufis in the period from 1000 to 1500 ventured to recently conquered or converted lands and sought to win popular following for the faith in India, Southeast Asia, and the sub-Saharan Africa. Sufis did not insist on a strict doctrinally correct understanding of Islam, but rather emphasized piety and devotion to Allah. They even tolerated continuing reverence of traditional deities by taking a flexible approach to their missions. The Sufis spread Islamic values without facing the resistance of unyielding and doctrine campaigns might have provoked. Christian missionaries. Meanwhile, Roman Catholic missionaries also traveled long distances in the interest of spreading Christianity. Missionaries accompanied the Crusaders and other forces to all the lands where Europeans extended their influence after the year 1000. In lands where European conquerors maintained a long-term presence, such as the Baltic lands of the Balkan region, Sicily, and Spain, missionaries attracted converts in large numbers, and Roman Catholic Christianity became securely established. The most ambitious missions sought to convert Mongols and Chinese to Roman Catholic Christianity. Yet even though Roman Catholic authorities in Europe dispatched many priests and missionaries to China, during the early 14th century, they ultimately won a few converts. In part, East Asia was just too distant for the resources available to the Roman Catholic Church. Moreover, Christianity seemed to have little appeal to East Asian peoples who already possessed sophisticated religious and cultural traditions. Long-distance travel and cross-cultural exchanges. Cultural exchanges, long-distance travel of all kinds, whether for commercial, political, diplomatic, or missionary purposes, encourage cultural exchanges between peoples of different societies. Songs, stories, religious ideas, philosophical views, and scientific knowledge all passed readily among travelers who ventured into the large world during the era from 1000 to 1500 CE. The troubadours of Western Europe, for example, drew on the poetry, music, and love songs of Muslim performers when developing the literature of courtly love. Similarly, European scientists avidly consulted their Muslim and Jewish counterparts in Sicily and Spain to learn about their understanding of the natural world. Large numbers of travelers also facilitated agricultural and technological diffusion during the period from 1000 to 1500. The magnitude compass, for example, invented in China during the Tang or Song dynasty, spread throughout the Indian Ocean basin during the 11th century, and by the mid-12th century, European mariners used compasses in the Mediterranean and the Atlantic Ocean. The compass was a boon to maritime trade because it allowed mariners to sail over long stretches of deep water with confidence in their ability to find their destinations and return home safely. Spread of the crops. Long-distance journeys enabled Muslim travelers to introduce new food and commercial crops, such as citrus fruits and Asian rice, to sub-Saharan Africa, which enriched West African diets after the 11th century. Muslims also introduced cotton to West Africa, and by 1100, cotton fabrics had become popular with the ruling elites and wealthy merchants of the West African kingdoms. Cotton grew well in the savannas, and by 1500 it was the principal textile produced in sub-Saharan Africa. Sugarcane. Muslims were also instrumental in the continuing diffusion of sugarcane. Muslim merchants and other travelers had begun large-scale cultivation of sugarcane in Southwest Asia and North Africa during the Abbasid Caliphate after the 12th century. Muslims facilitated the westward spread of sugarcane by acquainting European crusaders with crystallized sugar refined from cane. Up to that time, Europeans had little access to refined sugar, and they relied on honey and fruits as sweeteners. They immediately appreciated the convenience of refined sugar. Italian interpreters began to organize sugarcane plantations on Mediterranean islands such as Sicily, Cyprus, Crete, and Rhodes, and investors began to seek suitable locations throughout the Mediterranean basin. The cultivation of sugarcane had deep social and economic implications, like their Muslim predecessors. European sugar producers often staffed their plantations with slave laborers, and the growth of plantations fueled an increasing demand for Muslim war captives and black Africans who could supply labor services. Beginning in the 16th century, Europeans sought to recreate this model when they established large sugarcane plantations in the Americas. Indeed, the diffusion of sugarcane is only one important example of how the increased pace of trade, cultural interaction, and conquest in the period 1000 to 1500 allowed ideas, technologies, and material goods to spread throughout the eastern West Hemisphere on an unprecedented scale. Here is the picture. Crisis and recovery. As Eurasian peoples traveled, traded, and interacted over long distances, they also unwittingly spread disease pathogens. When diseases broke out among previously unexposed populations, they often caused widespread epidemics that severely disrupted whole societies. During the 14th century, bubonic plague erupted in epidemics that ravaged societies throughout most of Asia, Europe, and North Africa. Epidemic plague struck intermittently until the 17th century, but by the 15th century, Chinese and Western European societies in particular had begun to recover from its effects. The bubonic plague, the Little Ice Age, about 1300 CE, a process of global climatic change caused temperatures to decline significantly throughout the world. For more than 500 years, the Earth experienced a Little Ice Age when temperatures were much cooler than in the era of 1000 to 1300 CE. Markedly cooler temperatures meant shorter growing season, which caused agricultural production to decline in many lands. Across much of Eurasia, the cooler temperatures of the Little Ice Age made it more difficult to produce enough food for subsistence. That in turn led to famine and sometimes even starvation. In some northerly lands, such as Greenland, agriculture ceased to be a practical possibility. Origins of epidemic bubonic plague. As they struggled to cope with the cooling climate, peoples in much of the Eastern Hemisphere suddenly encountered a new challenge. In the form of devastating epidemic disease, bubonic plague spread from the Yunnan region of southwestern China, where it probably had been an epidemic for centuries. The plague bacillus infects rodents such as rats, squirrels, and prairie dogs, and fleas transmit the pathogen from one rodent to another. If rodent populations decline, fleas seek other hosts and sometimes spread the disease to human victims. In the early 14th century, Mongol military campaigns helped spread plague from Yunnan to China's interior, and by the 1350s it had spread to widely scattered regions of China. In some afflicted areas, contemporaries reported that plague carried away 2/3 of the population. The spread of the plague. During the 1340s, Mongols, merchants, and other travelers helped spread the disease along trade routes west of China. By 1346, it had reached the Black Sea ports of Kaffa and Tana. In 1347, Italian merchants fled. Plague infected Black Sea ports and unwittingly spread the disease throughout the Mediterranean basin. By 1348, following the trade routes, plague had sparked epidemics in most of Western Europe. Wherever it appeared, bubonic plague, which Europeans referred to as the Black Death, struck the frightful effects. Victims developed inflamed lymph nodes, particularly in the neck, armpit, and groin areas, and most died within a few days after the onset of symptoms. Internal hemorrhaging often discolored the inflammations to a black or purple hue. These swellings were called buboes, which gave rise to the term bubonic plague. Bubonic plague typically killed 60 to 70% of its human victims. In small villages and towns, disease wiped out the entire population. Plague was also returned to claim new victims in Europe. Plague erupted intermittently from the 1340s until the late 1600s. Some parts of the Eastern Hemisphere did not suffer directly from plague epidemics. The long cold winters of Scandinavia, for example, discouraged the proliferation of plague-wearing rodents and fleas. For reasons unknown, India also seemed to have avoided the worst effects of the plague. In fact, Indian populations grew from 91 million in the year 1300 to 97 million a century later. Epidemics also largely bypassed sub-Saharan Africa. Population decline. In lands hard hit by plague, however, it took a century and more to begin recovery from demographic consequences of the disease. In 1300, China's population, already reduced by conflicts with the Mongols, stood at 85 million. In 1400, after about 70 years of the epidemic plague, China's population amounted to only 75 million. A century later, demographic recovery was underway, and China's population rebounded to 100 million. European society also reeled from the efforts of the bubonic plague. From 79 million in 1300, European population dropped by almost 25% to 60 million in 1400. As in China, demographic recovery in Europe was underway in 1500. when European population climbed to 81 million. Islamic societies in Southwest Asia, Egypt, and North Africa also suffered devastating population losses and demographic recovery that took much longer than the China and Europe. In Egypt, human population probably did not reach pre-plague levels until the 19th century. I'm going to go ahead and do connecting the sources so that you can kind of zoom in on that for you. Social and economic effects. Because of its heavy demographic toll, bubonic plague disrupted societies and economies throughout Eurasia and North Africa. Such high death rates caused huge labor shortages, which in turn generated social unrest. In Western Europe, for example, urban workers demanded higher wages and many left their homes in search of better conditions. Political authorities responded by freezing wages and forbidding workers to leave their homes. Peasants in the countryside also sought to improve their circumstances by moving to regions where landlords offered better terms. Landlords responded to this challenge by restricting the freedom of peasants to move. As a result of sharply conflicting interests, disgruntled workers and peasants mounted a series of rebellions that rocked both the towns and the countryside of Western Europe, and were extinguished only after considerable social disruption and loss of life. By the 17th century, the plague had lost most of its ferocity. Epidemics occurred more sporadically, and they did not seriously diminish human populations. Since the 1940s, antibiotic drugs have brought the disease largely under control among human populations, although it survives in rodent communities throughout much of the world. Here's the main jar. Recovery in China. By the mid-14th century, the Mongols' Yuan dynasty was experiencing very difficult times. Financial mismanagement led to serious economic difficulties, and political conflicts led to the factional fighting among the Mongols themselves in 1368. With bubonic plague raging, the Yuan dynasty collapsed, and the Mongols departed China in Masse, leaving China in a state of both demographic and political turmoil. However, an increasing birth rate soon helped to replenish human numbers and political recovery, accompanied the demographic rebound. Hongwu. When the Yuan dynasty fell, the governance of China returned to Chinese hands. The new emperor came from a family so poor that he spent much of his youth as a beggar. Because of his size and strength, he came to the notice of military commanders, and he made his way through the ranks to lead the rebellious forces that toppled the Yuan dynasty. In 1368, he became the emperor of Hongwu, and he proclaimed the establishment of the Ming brilliant dynasty, which lasted until 1644. Sorry about that. Ming centralization. Hongwu immediately set about eliminating all traces of Mongol rule and establishing a government on the model of the traditional Chinese dynasties. Although Hongwu had little interest in scholarly matters, he reestablished the Confucian educational and civil service systems to ensure a supply of talented officials and bureaucrats. At the same time, he moved to centralize his authority in 1380, when he suspected his chief minister of involvement in a treasonous plot. Hongwu executed the minister and his allies, and then abolished the minister's position altogether. From that time forward, the Ming emperors ruled directly without the aid of chief ministers. Mandarins and the eunuchs. The Ming emperors insisted on absolute obedience to the policies and initiatives of central government. They relied heavily on the mandarins, a special class of officials sent out as emissaries of the central government to ensure local compliance with imperial policy. The Ming emperors also relied more heavily on eunuchs than had any of their predecessors. Eunuchs had long been considered reliable because they could not generate families and build power bases that might challenge ruling houses. Yet Ming emperors, intent on centralizing, placed even more importance on the service of eunuchs because they expected that servants whose fortunes depended exclusively on the emperor's favor would work especially diligently to advance the emperor's interest. The tightly centralized administration instituted by the early Ming emperors lasted more than 500 years. Although the dynasty fell in 1644 to Manchu invaders who founded the Qing dynasty, the Manchus retained the administrative framework of the Ming state, which largely survived until the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911. Economic recovery while building a centralized administration. The Ming emperors also worked toward economic recovery. The new rulers conscripted laborers to rebuild irrigation systems that had fallen into disrepair, and agricultural production surged as a result. At the same time, they promoted the manufacture of porcelain, lacquerware, and fine silk and cotton textiles. They did not actively promote the trade with other lands, but private Chinese merchants conducted a thriving business market, marketing Chinese products in ports and trading cities from Japan to the islands of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, domestic trade surged within China, reflecting increasing productivity and prosperity. Cultural revival. Alongside political and economic recovery, the Ming dynasty sponsored a kind of cultural revival in China. Emperor Hongwu tried to eradicate all signs to the recent nomadic occupation by discouraging the use of Mongol names and the wearing of Mongol dress. The Ming emperors actively promoted Chinese cultural schools. Hongwu's successor, Yangli, even organized the preparation of a vast encyclopedia that compiled all significant works of Chinese history, philosophy, and literature. The Yongle Encyclopedia ran to almost 23,000 manuscript rolls, each equivalent to a medium-sized book, and was a clear signal of Ming interest in supporting native Chinese cultural traditions. Recovery in Western Europe. State building. Demographic recovery strengthened states in Western Europe as it did in China. In Europe, however, political authority rested with a series of regional states rather than a centralized empire. By the late 15th century, states in Italy, Spain, France, and England had devised techniques of government that vastly enhanced their power. During the later Middle Ages, 1300 to 1500, internal problems, as well as the bubonic plague, complicated European political affairs. The Holy Roman Empire survived in name, but effectively authority lay with the German princes and the Italian states rather than the emperor. In Spain, descendants of Muslim conquerors held the kingdom of Granada in the southern portion of the Iberian Peninsula. Meanwhile, the kings of France and England sparred constantly over lands claimed by both. Taxes and armies. By the late 15th century, however, regional states in Western Europe had greatly strengthened their societies. The state-building efforts of the later Middle Ages involved two especially important elements. The first was the development of fresh sources of finance, usually through new taxes levied directly on citizens and subjects. The second was the maintenance of large standing armies, which, particularly since the 100 Years' War, were often composed of mercenary forces and equipped with gunpowder weapons supported by state funds. Italian states. The state-building process began in Italy, where profits from industrial production and trade enriched the major cities. Beginning in the 13th century, the principal Italian states of the city-states of Milan, Venice, and Florence, the Papal State in Rome, and the Kingdom of Naples began to finance their needs for military forces and larger bureaucracies by levying direct taxes and issuing long-term bonds that they repaid from treasury receipts. With fresh sources of finance, the principal Italian states strengthened their authority within their boundaries, as well as in their surrounding areas. France and England. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Italian administrative methods made their way beyond the Alps, partly because of the enormous expenses they incurred during the 100 Years' War, 1337 through 1453. The kings of France and England began to levy direct taxes and assemble powerful armies. Rulers in both lands asserted the authority of the central government over the nobility. In France, King Louis XI reigned 1461 to 1483. Accomplished this by maintaining a permanent army of about 15,000 well-armed troops. Because the expense of maintaining such forces was beyond the means of the nobility, Louis and his successors enjoyed a decisive edge over ambitious subordinates seeking to challenge royal authority. Spain. The process of state building was most dramatic in Spain, where the marriage in 1469 of Ferdinando of Aragon and Isabel of Castile united the two wealthiest Iberian realms. Receipts from the sales tax, the primary source of royal income, supported a powerful standing army. Under Ferdinando and Isabel, popularly known as the Catholic Kings, Christian forces completed the Reconquista by conquering the Kingdom of Granada and absorbing it into their state. The Catholic kings also projected their authority beyond Iberia when a French army threatened the Kingdom of Naples in 1494. They seized southern Italy, and in 1559, Spanish forces had established their hegemony throughout most of the Italian peninsula. Competition between European states intensified as they tightened their authority in their territories. This competition led to frequent small-scale wars between European states, and it encouraged the rapid development of military and naval technology. As states sought technological advantages over their neighbors, they encouraged the refinement and improvement of weapons, ships, and sails. When one state acquired powerful weapons, such as ships equipped with cannons, neighboring states sought to outdo their rivals with more advanced devices. Thus, technological innovations vastly strengthened European armies, just as they began to venture again into the larger world. Recovery in Western Europe. The Renaissance. Demographic recovery and state-building efforts in Western Europe coincided with a remarkable cultural flowering known as the Renaissance. The French word Renaissance means rebirth, and it refers to a period of artistic and intellectual creativity from the 14th to the 16th century in Western Europe, which reflected increasing European participation in the affairs of the Eastern Hemisphere.
Painters, sculptors, and architects of the Renaissance era drew inspiration from classical Greek and Roman artists rather than from their medieval predecessors. In their efforts to revive classical aesthetic standards, they transformed European art. Meanwhile, Renaissance scholars known as humanists looked to classical rather than medieval literary models, and they sought to update medieval moral thought and to adapt it to the needs of a bustling urban society. Italian Renaissance art. Just as they pioneered new techniques of statecraft, the Italian city-states also pioneered Renaissance innovations in art and architecture in search of realistic depictions. Italian artists studied the human form and represented the emotions of their subjects. Italian painters such as Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519, relied on the technique of linear perspective to represent the three dimensions of real life on dimensional surfaces. Sculptors such as Donatello, 1386 to 1466, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, sought to depict their subjects in natural poses that reflected the actual workings of human muscles rather than the awkward and rigid postures of earlier sculptures. Renaissance architecture. Renaissance architects designed buildings in the simplest, elegant style preferred by their classical Greek or Roman predecessors. Their most impressive achievement was the construction of domed buildings, awesome structures that enclosed large spaces but kept them open and airy under massive domes. Roman architects had built domes, but their technology and engineering did not survive in the collapse of the Roman Empire. In the early 15th century, however, the Florentine architect Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377 to 1446, reinvented equipment and designs for a large dome. During the 1420s and the 1430s, he oversaw the construction of a magnificent dome on the Cathedral of Florence, which residents took as a symbol of the city's wealth and leadership and artistic and cultural affairs. The humanists, like Renaissance artists and architects, scholarly and literary figures known as humanists, drew inspiration from classical models. The term humanist referred to scholars interested in the humanities, literature, history, and moral philosophy. They had nothing to do with the secular and often anti-religious interest of movements that go under the name of humanism today. On the contrary, Renaissance humanists were deeply committed to Christianity. Several humanists worked diligently to prepare accurate texts and translations of the New Testament and other important Christian writings. Most notable of them was the Desiderius Erasmus of Rotterdam, 1466 to 1536, who in 1516 published the first edition of the Greek New Testament, along with a revised Latin translation and copious annotations. Other humanists drew inspiration from the intense spirituality and high moral standards of early Christianity and promoted those values in their society. Humanists scorned the dense and often convoluted writing style of the scholastic theologians. Instead, they preferred the elegant and polished language of classical Greek and Roman authors and early church fathers, whose work they considered more engaging and more persuasive than those of the medieval philosophers and theologians. Thus, humanists such as the Florentine Francesco Petrarca, sorry if I mispronounced, known in English as the Patriarch, 1304 to 1374, traveled throughout Europe searching for manuscripts of classical works in the monastic libraries of Italy, Switzerland, and southern France. They found hundreds of Latin writings that medieval scholars had overlooked. During the 15th century, Italian humanists became acquainted with Byzantine scholars and largely enlarged the body of classical Greek as well as Latin works available to scholars. Humanist moral thought. Classical Greek and Latin values encouraged the humanists to reconsider the medieval ethical teachings. Medieval moral philosophers had taught that most honorable calling was that of monks and nuns who withdrew from the world and dedicated their lives to prayer and contemplation. But the humanists drew inspiration from classical authors such as Cicero, who demonstrated that it was possible to lead a morally virtuous life while participating actively in the affairs of the world. Renaissance humanists argued that it was perfectly honorable for Christians to enter into marriage, business relationships, and public affairs. And they offer spirited defense for those who rejected the cloister in favor of an active life in society. Humanist moral thought thus represented an effort to reconcile Christian values and ethics with the increasingly urban and commercial society of Renaissance Europe and the larger world. Quite apart from the conscious effort to draw inspiration from classical antiquity, Renaissance art and thought also reflected increasing European participation in the affairs of the Eastern Hemisphere. As merchants linked Europe to the larger hemispheric economy, here when they do that, here we go. Here's the St. Mark in Alexandria. European peoples experienced increased prosperity, which enabled them to invest resources in artistic production and support for scholarship. Renaissance painters filled their canvases with images of silk garments, ceramic vessels, lacquered wood, spice jars, foreign peoples, and exotic animals that had recently come to European attention. Princes and wealthy patrons commissioned hundreds of these paintings, which brought a cosmopolitan look to their palaces, residences, and places of business. The enchantment with the larger world extended also into the realm of ideas. The Italian humanist Giovanni Pica della Mirandola, 1463 to 1494, perhaps best reflected the enthusiasm of Renaissance scholars to comprehend the world beyond Western Europe. In his exuberant oration on the dignity of man, 1486, Pico made a spirited effort to harmonize the divergent teachings of Plato, Aristotle, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, not to mention Zoroastrianism, and various occult and mystical traditions. His ambitious endeavor was ultimately unsuccessful. Pico had limited information about several of the traditions he sought to reconcile, and he sometimes offered superficial interpretations of doctrines that he imperfectly understood. Nevertheless, his oration gave eloquent voice of the burning desire of many European scholars to understand the larger world. It is not surprising that just as Pico and other Renaissance humanists were undertaking that effort, European mariners were organizing expeditions to explore the lands and seas beyond Christendom. Exploration and colonization. As people of the Eastern Hemisphere recovered from demographic collapse and restored order to their societies, they also sought to revive the networks of long-distance trade and communication that epidemic plague had disrupted. Most active in that effort were China and Western Europe, the two societies that recovered most rapidly from the disasters of the 14th century. During the early Ming Dynasty, Chinese ports accommodated foreign traders and Mariners mounted a series of enormous naval expeditions that visited almost all parts of the Indian Ocean basin. Meanwhile, by the end of the 15th century, Europeans not only had established sea lanes to India, but also had made several return voyages to the American continents. This inauguration, a process that brought all the world's people into permanent and sustained interaction. Here is the map. Here's the diffusion of technologies. The Chinese reconnaissance of the Indian Ocean basin. Having ousted the Mongols, the early Ming emperors were not eager to have large numbers of foreigners residing in China. Yet the emperors permitted foreign merchants to trade in the closely supervised ports of Kangzhou and Guangzhou, where they obtained Chinese silk, porcelain, and manufactured goods in exchange for pearls, gems, spices, and cotton fabrics. The early Ming emperors also refurbished the large Chinese navy built during the Song dynasty, and they allowed Chinese merchants to participate in overseas trading ventures in Japan and Southeast Asia. Zhang He's expedition. Moreover, for almost 30 years, the Ming government sponsored a series of 7 unprecedented naval expeditions designed to establish a Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean basin. Emperor Yonggul organized the expedition for 2 main purposes: to impose imperial control over foreign trade with China and to oppress foreign peoples with the power and might of the Ming dynasty. Indeed, he might well have hoped to extend the tributary system by which the Chinese dynasties traditionally recognized foreign peoples to lands in the Indian Ocean basin. The expedition took place between 1405 and 1433. Leading them was the eunuch Admiral Zhang He, a Muslim from Yunnan in southwestern China, who became a trusted advisor of Yonggul Zhang. He embarked on each voyage with an awesome fleet of vessels, complemented by armed forces large enough to overcome resistance at any port where the expedition called. On their first voyage, for example, Zhang He's fleet consisted of 317 ships, accompanied by almost 28,000 armed troops. Many of these vessels were mammoth, 9-masted ships with 4 decks, capable of accommodating 500 or more passengers, measuring up to 124 meters, 408 feet long, and 51 meters, 166 feet wide. These ships were also by far the largest marine craft the world had ever seen. On the first 3 voyages, Zhang He took his fleet to Southeast Asia, India, Ceylon. The 4th expedition went to Persian Gulf and Arabia, and later expeditions ventured down the East African coast, calling at ports as far south as the Malindi in modern Kenya. Throughout his travels, Zhang He liberally dispensed gifts of Chinese silk, porcelain, and other goods. In return, he received rich and unusual presents, including African zebras and giraffes. Chinese naval power. Zhang He generally sought to attain his goals throughout diplomacy, and for the most part, he had little to engage in hostilities. But a contemporary reported that Zhang He did not shrink from violence when he considered it necessary to impress in foreign peoples with China's military might. He ruthlessly suppressed pirates who had long plagued Chinese and Southeast Asian waters. He also intervened in a civil disturbance to establish his authority in Ceylon, and he made displays of military force when local officials threatened his fleet in Arabia and East Africa. The 7 expeditions established a Chinese presence and reputation in the Indian Ocean basin. Returning from his fourth voyage, Zhang he brought envoys from 30 states who traveled to China and paid their respects at the Ming court. End of the voyages. Yet suddenly in the mid-1430s, the Ming emperors decided to end the expeditions. Confucian ministers who mistrusted Zhang, he and the eunuchs who supported the voyages argued that the resource committed to the expensive expeditions should go to better use. Moreover, during the 1420s and 1430s, the Mongols mounted a new military threat from the northwest, and land forces urgently needed financial support. Thus, in 1433, after Zhang his seventh voyage, the expeditions ended. Chinese merchants continued to trade in Japan and Southeast Asia, but imperial officials destroyed most of the nautical charts that Zhang he had carefully prepared. The decommissioned ships sat in the harbors until they rotted away. The Chinese craftsmen forgot the technology of building such large vessels, yet Zhang He's voyages demonstrated clearly that China could exercise military, political, and economic influence throughout the Indian Ocean basin. Here is the map of the travels. European exploration in the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. As Chinese fleets reconquered the Indian Ocean, European mariners were preparing to enter both the Atlantic and the Indian Ocean basins. Unlike Zhang, he and his companions, however, Europeans ventured into the seas not for diplomatic reasons, but to expand the boundaries of Roman Catholic Christianity and to profit from commercial opportunities. In the process, they made extensive use of technologies, particularly the magnetic compass and gunpowder, that had been diffused to Europe in the mid-12th and mid-13th centuries, respectively. Portuguese exploration. The experience of Portugal illustrates that mixture of motives. During the 15th century, Prince Henrique of Portugal, often called Prince Henry the Navigator, embarked in an ambitious campaign to spread Christianity and increase Portuguese influence on the seas. In 1415, he watched as Portuguese forces seized the Moroccan city of Chapt, which guarded the Strait of Gibraltar from the south. He regarded his victory as both a blow against Islam and as a strategic move, enabling Christian vessels to move freely between the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. Colonization of the Atlantic islands. Following the capture of Ceuta, Henrique encouraged Portuguese mariners to venture into the Atlantic. During their voyages, they discovered the Madres and Azores Islands, all uninhabited, which they soon colonized. Later discoveries included the Cape Verde Islands, Fernando Paso, Sao Tome, the Principe of the West African coast. Because these Atlantic islands enjoyed fertile soils and a Mediterranean climate, Portuguese entrepreneurs soon began to cultivate sugarcane. They're often in collaboration with Italian investors. Italians had financed sugar plantations in the Mediterranean islands since the 12th century, and their commercial networks provided a ready means to distribute sugar to Europeans who were rapidly developing a taste for the sweets. Slave trade. During the middle decades of the 15th century, a series of Portuguese fleets also explored excuse me, West African coast. Originally, the Portuguese traded guns, textiles, and other manufactured items for African gold and slaves. Soon, Portuguese traders changed the nature of the African slave trade by dramatically increasing its volume and sending slaves to new destinations. In the mid-15th century, the Portuguese dispatched thousands of slaves annually to recently founded plantations in the Atlantic islands where the slaves worked as laborers. The use of African slaves to perform heavy labor on commercial plantations soon became common practice, and it fueled the development of huge Atlantic-wide trade that, by the end of the 19th century, delivered as many as 12 million enslaved Africans to destinations in North America, South America, and the Caribbean region. Indian Ocean trade. While some Portuguese mariners traded profitably in West Africa, others sought to eliminate the role of Muslim and Italian intermediaries in the Asian silk and spice trades by finding a sea lane from Europe around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. By 1488, Bartolomeu Diaz had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean in 1947. Vasco da Gama departed Portugal with the intention of sailing to India after rounding the Cape of Good Hope. He cruised up the East African coast and found a Muslim pilot who showed him how to take advantage of the seasonal monsoon winds to sail across the Arabian Sea to India in 1498. He arrived at Calicut, and by 1499 he had returned to Lisbon with a hugely profitable cargo of pepper and spices. For most of the following century, Portuguese merchants and mariners dominated trade between Europe and Asia. Indeed, they attempted to control all shipping in the Indian Ocean by overpowering the vessels of Arabs, Persians, Indians, and Southeast Asians. They did not have enough ships to oversee all trade in the region, but the entry of Portuguese mariners into the Indian Ocean signaled the beginning of European imperialism in Asia. Christopher Columbus. While Portuguese seafarers sought a sea route round Africa to India, the Genoese mariner Cristoforo Colombo, known in English as Christopher Columbus, received the idea of sailing west to reach Asian markets because geographers in the Eastern Hemisphere knew nothing of the Americas. Columbus' notion made a certain amount of sense, although many doubted that his plan could lead a profitable trade because the long distances involved. After the King of Portugal declined to sponsor an expedition to test Columbus's plan, Ferdinando and Isabel of Spain agreed to underwrite a voyage. In 1492, Columbus set sail. Later that year, his fleet, 3 ships, reached land at San Salvador, the Watling Island, and the Bahamas. Columbus returned to Spain without the gold, silk, and spices that he had expected to find, but he persistently held that he had reached islands near the Asian mainland and the markets of China and Japan. Yet, although Columbus himself never acknowledged that his expedition had not reached Asia, by the end of the 15th century, other mariners who came to explore the Caribbean and the American continents realized that the Western Hemisphere constituted a world apart from Europe, Asia, and Africa. The summary. In 5 centuries between 1000 and 1500 CE, peoples in the Eastern Hemisphere interacted with more frequency than ever before. In part, this was because of the stability created by the large empires of the Mongols and other nomadic peoples, although conquest by these empires brought initial destruction to many societies. To the pacification of large areas that occurred after conquest allowed safe travel for traders, diplomats, and missionaries. The relative safety of long-distance travel encouraged peoples of the Eastern Hemisphere to exchange technologies, ideas, crops, and religious faiths with one another with ever-increasing frequency. Yet, just as we saw at the end of the classical period, one of the unintended consequences of the increased cross-cultural interaction was the spread of epidemic disease to distant regions. Indeed, in the 14th century, bubonic plague tore through much of Eurasia, leaving death and destruction in its wake and severely weakening cross-cultural ties. However, by the early 15th century, societies had begun to recover from the plague, and China and Europe, in particular, began to renew a cross-cultural contacts. Although both Chinese and European efforts at renewing these contacts had momentous consequences, the ocean voyages of Europeans in this period fundamentally shaped modern world history when they accidentally made contact with peoples from the Western Hemisphere. For the first time in human history, cross-cultural interactions began to connect peoples from both hemispheres with enormous significance for the entire globe. Now, I have been asked to read part 4, An Age of Cross-Cultural Interaction to 1000 to 1500. Although the post-classical societies of the Eastern Hemisphere had restored order and stability to the region by 1000 CE, invasions and conquest by nomadic peoples caused most of the post-classical societies to collapse between the 11th and the 14th centuries. These nomadic invaders included the Mongols, who conquered so much of Eurasia in the 13th and 14th centuries that they built the largest empire the world has ever seen. Mongol conquest initially resulted in monumental human and physical destruction. However, once conquest was complete, Mongol overlords facilitated accelerated communication within their vast imperial domains. Thus, from China to Eastern Europe, traders, diplomats, missionaries, travelers, and pilgrims moved overland with greater ease than ever before and encouraged ever stronger networks of communication and exchange. The Indian Ocean basin also grew far more integrated in the centuries between 1000 and 1500 CE. Indeed, by 1500, the Indian Ocean served as a highway linking peoples from China to East Africa. As with overland routes of the Mongol Empire, this Indian Ocean highway encouraged the diffusion of scientific and intellectual knowledge. Technologies like gunpowder and the compass, and food crops such as cotton and sugarcane, all of which profoundly influenced the development of societies throughout the Eastern Hemisphere. Yet, as at the end of the classical period, increased overland and seaborne interaction in the Eastern Hemisphere also led to the diffusion of disease pathogens. In the 14th century, the bubonic plague spread rapidly from China across most of Eurasia, leaving millions dead in its wake. Such massive fatalities severely disrupted networks of communication and trade. However, by the end of the 15th century, these networks had recovered once again. Indeed, they recovered so well that Western Europeans, who had long been on the margins of Eurasian trade networks, sought eagerly to find alternate routes to the lucrative markets of East and Southeast Asia, in one attempt to reach these markets by sailing west rather than east. Europeans instead stumbled on the Americas as the European mariners ventured across the Atlantic, and in the Americas, they unwittingly inaugurated a new era in world history because they initiated a long-term process that brought all regions and peoples of Earth into permanent and sustained interaction for the first time in human history. Indeed, the formation of and reconfiguration of global networks of power, communication, and exchange that followed from the initial contact between the two hemispheres rank among the most prominent themes of modern world history. Here's the timeline. I'll try and get that as close as I can. Should you want to pause and take a look at this. That is the end of chapter 18. Yes, of chapter 18. Thank you.